All right, welcome everyone. This webinar is going to cover DataStax Astra's GraphQL API. If you're with us here last week, we covered DataStax Astra's REST API, and we built a little app using their API that you can check out on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/AnantCorp. As mentioned before, if you have any questions, please direct them in the chat, or if you're watching this on YouTube, go ahead and leave them in the comment section, and we'll try to get to your answer those questions whenever we get a chance. All right. So a little about me. My name is Urban Patel, and I'm an apprentice here at Anant. I've been here since around December 2019. My last series that I covered was doing SQL and reporting on Apache Cassandra with open source tools. We covered Presto and Cassandra, Spark and Cassandra, open source notebooks in Cassandra, and open source BI tools in Cassandra. If you're curious about any of those, you can check out our YouTube channel, youtube.com/AnantCorp, and the webinars are there. There's also blogs and slide shares associated with them if you want to give those a read instead of a watch. And then, as mentioned before, last week, we explored DataStax Astra's REST API. Again, the link for the YouTube is there. If you want to go straight to the repo, so there is a template version where you can build your own from a template that I provided you for the REST API. It's built with React. So if you're familiar with JavaScript and React, that might be something you want to look into. There's also a completed version that's not refactored, but it gets the job done. If you just want to look at that instead and try it out, you can go ahead and open it straight in Gitpod if you want. And again, there's a blog and slideshare link associated with that topic as well. So this week, we're going to cover DataStax Astra's GraphQL API. If you're not really familiar with what GraphQL is, it's an open source data query and manipulation language for APIs and a runtime for fulfilling queries with existing data. GraphQL was actually developed by React in 2012 and then was released in 2015 to the public. So the nice thing about GraphQL versus REST APIs. REST APIs require loading from multiple URLs, so depending on your endpoints. So if you're using authentication, you might have an authentication endpoint, and then you have other tables that you would also need to query to specific endpoints for that. But GraphQL lets you do all of that in one single request. And these queries can always return predictable results because you know what you're querying, and you can also query exactly what you want. So you don't need to query the entire response. You can pick and choose what you need, and we'll take a look at that later. And if you're building GraphQL, the API itself, a lot of different programming languages support it. There's a link that if you click the list, you can go through all the different frameworks, languages, services, libraries, and other things that you can use to build your own GraphQL API. If you want to use a front-end service and utilize this DataStax GraphQL API, you could use something, again, in the JavaScript realm. Use Gatsby, which is a framework based on React. And then they have a plugin called Source GraphQL. That's essentially where you connect your DataStax Astra GraphQL API. And then you can run your queries through that. One limitation that I noticed through that was that it didn't like mutations. So with Astra's GraphQL API, we can do mutations on our data. But Gatsby didn't play nice with that. Maybe that was a user error on my part, but if you're able to figure that out, please leave a comment in the YouTube description or YouTube comment section, and that would be great. Also, another way to do that with React itself, there's a tool called Apollo GraphQL. And so they have a bunch of different clients. So they can also do iOS as well and Android, I believe. But they have React-based and other JavaScript framework clients. So if you don't want to use React, you can use Vue, you can use Ember, and you can use, I believe, Angular. So those are other options if you want to build a front end that uses DataStax Astra's GraphQL API directly without needing a separate API in the backend that handles talking to Astra itself. All right. So for the demo, we are going to look over the docs. There are some nuances that we're going to go over. We're also going to utilize DataStax Astra's Studio and I've already built a notebook for you that we'll use in conjunction with using Postman. So again, like I mentioned with Gatsby, there were some user errors potentially on my part to do mutations through GraphQL. And so I ended up just using Postman because Postman worked for mutations, and it would be easier because we can see our responses in real time right away. All right. And so if you have any questions, I'll pause here before we move on to the demo. Okay, looks like no questions. So we're going to look at the GraphQL API docs. And so a little bit of nuance with the REST API. If we just open that in a new tab, the REST API, you can do a lot more in terms of you can do CRUD. Actually, I'm going to go to the actual doc. So they have our authorization endpoint. So to use the GraphQL API, you will need the auth token. And to do that, you will need to make a call to the REST API, but everything else can be handled with the GraphQL. But what the REST API can do that the GraphQL cannot do is that you can do CRUD on columns, you can do CRUD on tables, and you can also access key spaces. With the GraphQL, you could only do CRUD on rows. And with that, I'll mention it when we get to the insert, but yeah. So using the GraphQL API, we generate our auth token by making a request to the auth REST endpoint. But essentially, your URL is almost pretty much the same as the REST API URL, but the REST API URL would be API/REST. Here it's API GraphQL. And also with the REST, depending on your endpoint. So you could have REST key space / table / row / etc. But with the GraphQL, you can do everything just with /GraphQL. And so with naming conventions, that something a little nuanced that might come up. So it does lower camel casing and upper camel casing. So if you have a field type or a column that has a underscore in it, so say if you have like a created date, and so it's created underscore date, that's going to get camel cased when you're doing your query. And we'll take a look at that when we open up Postman. But essentially, every time you generate a table on Astra, it generates a GraphQL object that you can access. So with the schema, you have queries and mutations. So this is just an example table they have for products. So with the queries, you can have your normal query, and then you can have options with it. So it's like ordering. You could do and then with the mutations, you could do if not exists and update options, etc. But with the mutations, so with the mutations, it would be insert, update, and delete. There are some nuances where insert and update are both upserts. So essentially, if the item doesn't exist, it's going to create it. If it does exist, it's just going to update it. However, if you set in the insert specifically, if you set if not exists, it's going to cause a lightweight transaction. And so with lightweight transactions in Cassandra, your latency it might increase. And so depending on how big your production is or how big your scale is, that might not be something you want to do. So you might need to tune it and optimize using the GraphQL depending on what data you're working with and the structure of it. And so with the update, similar thing. So if you have if exists and if conditions, so it's going to cause a lightweight transaction and it's going to potentially increase overhead to the query and increase latency. And so delete products, same thing. If you have an if exists or an if condition, it'll also create a lightweight transaction. So we're going to take a look at retrieving rows first, and then we'll go into the mutations. So this is just a normal GraphQL query. So the way that DataStax does it is we have the query name, the object name, like I mentioned, that comes from your table. And then here, you don't need this, but if you want to do like a get by ID, you can insert your ID primary key. But if you just want to return all, you can do it without this parentheses. And so your values, this would just be your columns. So we'll take a look at it when we're building our table. And so again, like I mentioned, so they do a kind of a get by ID. So they put in a specific primary key, and their primary key is this UUID, and they return the ID, name, price, description, and created for it. And that's exactly what they get. And then you can also have options where you can limit and you can set certain page sizes, etc. So that's nice where you, if you need to set up like pagination, etc. Let's see. And then ordering. So if you need to do ascending, descending, depending on your column. So now we'll go into adding rows. So they don't specifically mention it, but I tried playing with it. So their documentation examples only have mutations for a single object. So I was wondering if using their GraphQL API, can we do like a batch insert or like a multi-row insert? And there's no instructions for it on the documentation. And I tried playing with the query itself, but I wasn't able to get it work. So maybe potentially that's something that's coming up in the future, or I just didn't have the syntax correct. But essentially for the insert mutation, we're going to have our object name, so our table name, and then we're going to have the insert. So this is auto-generated. So it's insert and then camel casing with your table name, and then your value. So it's going to be your column name and then the value you're inserting into it. And so after that, what this second value option here is your insert response. So once it's been inserted, it's going to return you an object or array or your returned value of the inserted columns. So if you go down to the example where they say return these, it doesn't show you, but we'll see that when we're actually doing it with Postman. So if we go into updating, it's a very similar thing where you pick whatever table you have, your update, and then camel casing table name, your value object, and so that would be your key name. So it would be like ID or something you're updating. And then, like I mentioned, it's an upsert, same with insert. Excuse me. And the same thing here is where it's returning values that were updated. And then deleting is a little bit more simple, where you don't necessarily need this returned value because you're deleting a row, right? So you would just say whatever you're deleting by. So usually you just put your ID, your primary key, and that was and the value associated with that. And we'll take a look at that with Postman. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with the actual part of the demo. So first, what we're going to do is have our Astra table. And then if you don't know how to get started with Astra, you can check out our YouTube channel, youtube.com/AnantCorp. We have a bunch of getting starteds. And also, if you check out our repository on GitHub, github.com/Anant/Cassandra API, Cassandra.API, sorry. So that repo is something we built. We built an open source application, full stack, that uses a Node driver, and there's also a Python driver. So if you're familiar with Python versus Node and vice versa, you can get started full stack. All the instructions are written out for you. So that goes through setting up an Astra account, creating your databases, migrating data, and then doing an API, et cetera, et cetera. So you can go ahead and take a look at it in your own time. But right now, I already have this test database I created. My key space is called demo, my database is called demo. My key space is called test. But we're going to go ahead and download this Astra Studio notebook. So if you just click it, I already have it opened. I'm just going to download it. And then if I open up Studio, nice thing about Studios, all you got to do is drag and drop, and that's it. And then, so what we're doing here, so I'm just going to open up my schema view just to make sure we're seeing our tables being created. So we're going to create a table. So this is kind of a simplified version of like what I mentioned. So we have that repo, Cassandra.API on GitHub, where it's that full stack app. So there's a lot more column names or a lot more columns in that repository. But this is strictly just to show you how you can get started quickly with the GraphQL API. So essentially we have an ID. We're going to have tags, which are going to be associated with the URL. So it's essentially a way to gather links and then potentially theoretically on a front end display them. But if you look at our repo Cassandra.API, you'll get a better idea of what this process is. So we're going to have an ID per link. We're going to have tags, which is a list type for the link, the title of the link, the URL of it, a timestamp created at, language of the link, reading time, user ID, so whoever submitted it. So say if it's like it's a multi-team app that everyone's submitting links to, you can see who's added what, and then primary key is ID. So we're going to go ahead and hit run local quorum. If you've imported this in, you might need to select your key space first. So if yours is already not on your key space you're working with, just go ahead and select it. So we see our leaves table. So we're going to go ahead and add one record in, just simple, make it so that everyone can just follow along. And then it said success. And now we're just going to confirm that our data is there. And it is. So we have our ID created at, language, reading time, tags, title, URL, and the user who added it. So now if we go into Postman, first what we need to do is go back to our slide deck. And if you click on this sub bullet under Postman, you can copy this link. And that's a template collection I've already created for you that you can go ahead and quickly get started with. So if I open up Postman and then I go to import, I'm going to go to link, and then I'm just going to paste it in. And that's going to go ahead and import this GraphQL API demo collection I already have. So it's going to be a collection of 5 requests. So if you go ahead and open that up, so the first one we need to start with is authorization. And like I mentioned, this is going to point to the REST API. So to get our URL, so I have this template structure here. So it's Astra cluster ID and Astra cluster region. That's already given to us by Astra itself. So if we go onto our dashboard, so whenever we clicked on connect, if we go into our connection method, you can pick and choose. For right now, for the REST API, I'm just going to go ahead and copy everything before REST there, and then go into Postman and paste that in. So now we have our cluster ID and our zone. So if now we go into body, so we have to send a request body if you look at the docs for the REST API. And so we need to send a body with our username and password. These are just templates, but my credentials for this test database is just username and password. And I'm just going to hit send. And we got our auth token. Great. So this auth token is going to last for 30 minutes, and that's long enough so to do whatever we need to do. So we're just going to run this request at once. And I'm just going to go ahead and copy this token. So now the next request we're going to open is the GraphQL query, and this is going to be our quote unquote get. So our query to get our data, even though it's technically a post. So if we go into our headers, so this is the reason we need our auth token. We need to have a key value called X Cassandra token, and we're just going to go ahead and paste in our auth token. And then if we go to our GraphQL API, again, these are both the same. It's just everything after API is different. Doesn't matter where you copy and paste from, just copy until API. We're just going to paste that into this section. So now we have our GraphQL. So API.GraphQL. So now we have our auth token in body. So this is the way we structured it. So our query, like we showed you in the docs, we have our object name, which is our table. And then the values we're going to get back our ID created at, like I mentioned, if you have an underscore in your table. So if we look at when we create it, we called it created at and user ID. See how there's the underscore. So it's going to get camel cased. And that hyphens or that underscore is going to go away. So that's something you might get tripped up on if you're not familiar with GraphQL. And also they explained it in their docs. So if you're confused or anything, just go back and read something. So we're going to go ahead and just run this. And we get back our data. Obviously it doesn't look right. So we're just going to convert it into JSON. And so we look at it. So our values, we have our created at reading time 10, Reading time was another one that was had a reading underscore time, so it got camel cased. We see our tags that we added. We see our title, URL, and our user ID associated with it. Great, we know our query is working. So now let's say we want to add a row. So it's going to be the same thing. So it's going to be the same thing in terms of setup. Then we're going to look at the query itself. So we're just going to copy the token and add row using GraphQL. So we're going to go to headers. We're going to go to value, paste. And then if we go back and grab our URL, again, like I mentioned, you can just copy and paste the URL because that's the nice thing about GraphQL. You can do everything from one endpoint. So we're just going to go ahead and paste that in. And now if we look at our body, see now instead of query, like we have query in this body, we have query here. Instead, we're doing a mutation. So we're doing a mutation on our leaves object and we're inserting. So we're inserting a new item. So it's going to have an ID created at. So when you're adding items, again, you want to do camel casing back, even though your column name is called created underscore at. When you're doing your mutations, you want to use this correct camel casing here. Otherwise, it'll throw an error. So actually, let me show you what that looks like. So if I do just normal created at, because that's what our column looks like in Cassandra, right? So if I go ahead and add this, so again, like I mentioned before, this is going to be our returned value. So if we want to take some stuff out and we only want to look at the ID just to confirm that it was there, or say if you created something and then you want to display it right away on your front end, you might want to have everything returned back. But for simplicity's sake, we're just going to keep everything just to confirm everything went in. And then also, like I mentioned before, there was no documentation on doing batch inserts or multi-row inserts. So what I tried doing was having like a nested array of objects with values associated with each one. Tried a couple other methods, they didn't work. So like I mentioned, they might still be implementing that, or it just might not be a possible thing to do. But let's go back. So now we're going to get an error back when we do it like this with this created at. So if I hit send, and the nice thing is they give you what your issue might be. So invalid value. So it has this created at. So it says unknown field right here, created at unknown field. So if I change this back to camel casing, created at, we should get the response back correct. Great. So if I go back to JSON, we see our new item. So reading time 3, we see these new tags. Oh, this tag's actually messed that up. So it should be like that. Oh, I'll just leave it for now. It's fine. Then we see we're getting back our corrected data. So if we go back to our GraphQL query, and if we just run this again, we should see both items. So if I convert this into JSON, all right, we see this one, right? Cassandra lunch, that was the second one we added. So on Wednesdays also, if you check out our YouTube channel, we have a playlist called Cassandra Lunch. If you're new to Cassandra or if you're old Cassandra, we just talk about Cassandra topics and topics relating around Cassandra. If you want to be a guest speaker, you can reach us at solutions@anant.us, and we're open to everyone. And if you want to learn how you can get involved, you can go ahead in that playlist and you can look through the description of the playlist, and we have links to signing up and joining. All right, so now we have one record here and we have the second record here. So now if we go into our update row, so actually if we noticed, what we're doing here, so in our, where is it? Tags, we have 3. So we have Cassandra Launch, YouTube, blog. So now we're adding it, say we want to update the row or update the tags to be include SlideShare. So what we're going to go ahead and do is use the update leaves for the leaves object, and we're going to pass those values in, and then we're going to get back the same values when the return result. So if we go ahead and run that, oh no, we can't run it yet because we need to post in our updated URL and our token into the header. Paste, go back to the body, and I hit send. All right, looks like it went through. It's actually an issue here. I'm just going to fix this real quick. It's actually not doing it correctly. It's actually taking it as a string instead of a list. So I'm going to go ahead and update it again, and it should come through correctly. So if I go JSON, there we go. Now that's better. So I don't know what happened. I think when I saved it, it messed with it, but I'll fix it and the links will be updated. But essentially, so we fixed it from a string and converted it into a list. So now if we go back to our GraphQL query, and we see that, you see how it's a string here. If I go ahead and run this again, we should, authorization, just run it again. All right, let's go JSON. There we go. Now it's fixed. All right, so now we want to delete something. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy in our delete, or open up our delete row GraphQL request. I'm going to go ahead and copy in our URL, and then copy in our Cassandra token. All right, and then if you're going to the body, we're saying the leaves object, delete leaves. We're going to delete the value that has the primary key ID. And let's go ahead and hit run. All right, so we see that it was deleted. Let me just confirm, make sure which one is which. 536 AE. Okay, so this is the one we just created. So now if we go back, we should see only one result in our GraphQL query. Open it up, and we do. There's only one. So our Cassandra lunch one is gone. Great. So we now know that just working with one table, we're able to read data from it. We're able to insert data to it, update that data, and then delete that data. Say if we have two tables, the documentation didn't really cover that, right? So hopefully I'll be able to explain it and you can learn how to do it. So it's similar in the way that just because their documentation, I'll say retrieving rows. So they're only using one object name. So where we have this object name, we're just going to go ahead and add another object outside of the scope. So within the query scope, but outside of the object name scope. So we're going to go ahead and create in our DataStax Studio. If we scroll down to the fourth cell, we're going to create a users table where we're going to have the user ID, which we can eventually correlate with this user integer here, first name and last name. So we're going to go ahead and create this table. And then we're going to insert into it. So we're going to do the user ID and then my name. All right, great. We're not going to check this works here. We're going to check if it worked in Postman. So if we go into our query for our GraphQL query, so outside of the scope of leaves, we're going to create the same exact thing. So we are going to match this up. So, okay, so we're going to say the new object, because our table is called users, it's going to be the users object, and the values that we're going to return are going to be user ID. And again, it's going to be camel casing. So this was the column name in Cassandra. With GraphQL, it's going to be user ID. Then we're also going to return back first name, and it's going to be last name. Again, because there's underscores between first name and underscores between last and name, it's going to get camel cased in the same way. So if when we run this, we ideally should get back data from leaves, and we should ideally get back data from users. So if I go ahead and hit run, see if I can expand this, and I go to JSON, great. So we have our leaves object, and we're able to return back Cassandra API from the the very first insert we did on DataStax Studio, because remember we deleted Cassandra.Link. And then we get back our users data. So if on your front end you're doing authentication, you can utilize that. But yeah, we're able to get back data from multiple tables within one query. So now with GraphQL, we don't have to query our leaves endpoint and then also query our users endpoint, depending on however many endpoints we have there. With one GraphQL query, we can get back data from multiple tables, which is great because it simplifies it and we can control it. So say if we don't want to get back all this extra stuff, say we only want to get back ID, we'll keep created at, we don't need language or reading time. We'll keep tags, we'll keep user ID. I'll get rid of tags just so we can see just the difference of it. So we're going to get back the ID of the link. We're going to get back the created at, the title, URL, and user ID. Even though we have data for all of these in our table, we're only going to query specific columns we want to return back. So if I hit send, and I expand this again, see, we got back the same exact data, just without the other stuff we did not need. So that's a great thing about GraphQL. And with DataStax Astra utilizing GraphQL, it makes it even better. So we don't have to worry about potentially like programmatic filtering, etc. And we can do everything and query the exact data we need straight through this API. And that will go ahead and wrap up our demo portion. I'll go back to the slides. Thank you for joining us here. I hope you were able to take something away and learn a little bit about DataStax Astra's GraphQL API. If you want to reach us here at Anant, you can reach us at anant.us, or you can email us at solutions@anant.us. And if you ever have any questions or you want to partner an ally on your Cassandra platform, don't hesitate to reach out, because that's what we do. And I'll open the floor back up to questions, and you can go ahead and direct them in the chat. All right, looks like no questions. Again, thank you everyone for joining us. If you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. If you have any questions with Cassandra, or you want to partner an ally on your Cassandra platform, you can reach out to us here at Anant at anant.us, or you can email us at solutions@anant.us. Thank you.